So let me say a word about the League, and then I'll introduce our co-sponsors. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We try to educate voters and help them be informed voters. We do not endorse any candidates or any parties or work against any candidates or any parties. So the spirit of tonight's presentation is to help Rochester voters get informed about issues that are relevant in the upcoming elections. And we are thankful to the Zeta Beta Phi sorority, the Psi Omega Zeta chapter, for co-sponsoring with us. So I think that's all the prelims we need. So Reverend Myra, if you would turn on your camera and your audio now, and Shani, you can turn on your audio as well, and we can start the conversation. So on the background for inviting people to this webinar, I said police violence is a problem here. Rochesterians voted to create the Police Accountability Board in 2019. So questions such as what is happening, what needs to happen, what are the roadblocks? And so I think I'd like to throw it out to one of you. I'm not sure which person wants to go first. Reverend Myra, do you want to go first? By the way, I was on Reverend Myra's Facebook page today, and your graphic at the top of your Facebook page makes it look like the police are accountable to you in particular. That was a very impressive photo from the news that was taken in September.
Yeah, I wish that was the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So share with us what your thinking is at this time about police accountability in Rochester.
Yeah, so for me, when we look at the history of Rochester, we never really historically built in police accountability for Black and Brown communities in particular. So our blueprint, Rochester's blueprint for policing, was constructed in 1819. Really a very racist, white supremacy era of our history. And so the questions that were being asked around public safety weren't ever really about protecting and serving Black and Brown folks. It was completely about attending to white anxiety, because the question was, what do we do with the Black and Brown folks who are now being released from enslavement and moving about in the world in these predominantly white spaces, right? And so it was policing that answered the question. And that's why it was really from the beginning designed to attend to white anxiety and to protect white property and wealth on the backs of Black and Brown folks, whether that meant pain, whether that meant violence, whether that meant trauma. It really was not a factor. What was centered is the needs and the anxiety of white people. So it explains for us why Black and Brown communities, really from the inception of policing in this country, have never felt safe, right? The whole civil rights movement of the 60s was just a brutal, overt example of how policing in its militarized form and paramilitarized form is used and uses itself to attend and to harm Black and Brown bodies really at will, right? And so Rochester is no different than many other cities. We've never really done anything about that blueprint, and it's the blueprints of policing that allows us to have the kind of permissions that we have, right? And the kinds of behaviors that are permitted. And so I think we're in a moment in history where we've started to see that pattern across the US more than we ever have, right? Because of technology and social media, right? And the ability for somebody to flip out their cell phone and take a video. Now we get to actually see what Black and Brown folks have been saying really for centuries, right? And so Black and Brown communities have been living with this trauma and with this reality for a very long time, with white communities not really believing us, right? Because if you were white, you weren't having that experience and you didn't know what we were talking about, right? And so Black and Brown communities were viewed as simply overreacting. But now we know that it's, George Floyd's killing that was so public during a pandemic when everybody was glued to the television, and we got to see a glimpse of it up close. But we have to remember it was just a glimpse, right? That Black and brown communities are dealing with this kind of trauma, this kind of violence from policing, this dualistic relationship of sometimes I'll come in and I'll protect you and attend to the crimes in your community, and sometimes I'll be the criminal against you, right? I will be the one, and there will be nothing in the system to keep me from harming you, because the system was created with no accountability for Black and brown folks. And so what I believe that we need, and those that I've been working with and in the community, the Faith Leaders Roundtable, which is a group of Black pastors and churches, the local NAACP that has just kind of restarted. We've been working on that. I have an anti-racism team at church, and we've been working on that and working with activists on the ground. And what we believe is we need a new policing blueprint, first of all, that asks the right question, right? Instead of, what do we do with Black and brown folks and how do we attend to white anxiety? How about, how do we get to public safety and thriving communities? Now that's a better premise for creating a true public safety model. And if you do that, you can get to a different mission and a different vision for public safety. And so what I proposed in a new policing blueprint proposal that we submitted to the city of Rochester is that the mission could be to accelerate an end to racism in policing by focusing on public safety practitioners and partnership models that create thriving communities for all, for white people and people of color. And the new vision could be to really create a racially just policing blueprint that fosters community trust, investment, and mutual partnerships. And I believe that the Police Accountability Board is one of those mutual partnerships that can help us get to that. And so we can choose to stay with a model that continues to dehumanize part of the human family and to render them vulnerable perpetually and put them at risk perpetually because of the socializations of fear of that which is Black and brown, and racism systemically and institutionally has done that to us. Or we can choose to go in a new direction, right, and be thought leaders on creating something that is transformative in our city, in our community, in our humanity, and in the relationships that we have.
Wow, there's nothing ambitious there, is there? Let me interrupt before I throw it to Shani. I forgot to mention that the audience is invited to submit questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button. And if you're on Facebook Live, you can put them in the comments, and we've got somebody watching those, and we will get those questions into the discussion here. So Shani, where do you want to go with that?
Yeah, I guess I'll just, well, first of all, I mean, thanks for having me. I always love talking to Myra in any type of setting or situation. We've had a lot of discussions over the last, I would say the last year that I've known her pretty well. So I always welcome these kinds of discussions, and really I'm happy to be able to discuss the nature of policing in Rochester, especially. So, when she was talking, I was just thinking about, the fact that, injustice at the hands of RPD, really, what are we trying to, why are we trying to use small scale reforms to preserve just this policing blueprint that, Reverend Myra is talking about? A lot of people are not interested in preserving what we have. And, these small scale reforms that we've seen over the years here, really just does just that. Really what we're asking for out of the Police Accountability Board is we are putting community at the center of the conversation instead of at the periphery or on the side, just looking in. We understand too from, what Reverend Myra says that, we have that these systems were meant to police us and to keep us small and not necessarily meant to keep us safe. And so, when you ask the community what, how would they like to be policed? That's a new story. That's a new statement. And, I think that, I really am excited about the PAB. And I had a meeting with somebody this morning that is like, we're really excited to see what happens, because out of everything that's happening here, we've seen a lot of things not work. They either lose funding or they lose interest, or, people just get burned out. But, the more community that we can center this conversation around, I think that the stronger and the more momentum it'll build. And I think that's what makes this so different because, even when you think about, what is government really, right? When you think about like policing and government and all these things, really just community members getting together to collectively decide how they would like to be governed or how they would like to be kept safe, right? And I really just want to draw attention to, the fact that, those that do not want to center these community conversations are really, really need to be really, we've been seeking them out, talking to them, wondering, how can we get them to buy into the fact that community has to be at the center of reimagining or reshaping or, dismantling any type of policing system that we have. And, as a, so I'm a physician assistant by trade. Some of you all know that. I've seen, people that have been victimized by police. I've seen it in just the last 2 weeks. So there are a lot of things that need to be done, not just in discipline, but in also in policy, procedures, and practices, which is what, which is the bulk of what we're dealing with, I believe, when we're talking about police misconduct. So
I think we've already said some really important things that I'm not sure everyone understands, because I didn't understand it until relatively recently. When I first heard about a police accountability board, I thought, okay, that makes sense, because what you've got is the police investigating the police, and so they're not holding themselves accountable. And I've watched enough cop shows on TV to have an idea how hard it is for an organization to police itself. So I thought it was just externalizing the policing of the police, but it's really a lot more than that. It really is reinventing the blueprint of what police do. And that's really fascinating to me. So when Myra was talking about the original blueprint for the police, that wasn't a Rochester invention, right? That was all over the country that you were talking about.
No,
So,
that was in New York State. That was in New York State. Actually, that was actually a Rochester invention. 1819 was the creation of the blueprint for policing for Rochester. There are parts of New York State that probably had similar eras. Each city would have to research their own history of when their blueprint of policing and public safety was crafted. But if you go to the Rochester Police website, they'll tell you that it began in 1819 and was patterned after the night watch and constables. And they were white males who from different families that had to sign up for shifts, to watch folks. So that is our particular Rochester, New York history.
okay, yeah. And I mean, I've heard, in the South, they had what do they call them? The slave patrols that were out looking for escaped slaves. So there's some variation, but overall there's a similarity. And so what I'm wondering is now today, if we're reinventing what policing means in Rochester, is this part of a national conversation that's going on? Are there other cities that are rethinking this? Or are we way out on the cutting edge here? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit all over the place, right? And I will just say that the slave patrol model is what the 1819 blueprint was modeled after. We do have a slave patrol model of policing in Rochester. In 1819, that's exactly what it flowed from. So you have, I think since George Floyd, it was so shocking to the world, and that states really across the US started thinking, oops, right, we better do something, right? And so I think there's states all over the US that have been discussing this and looking at it, and realizing that they need to make some change. But how much change has been the issue, right? So what Shani talks about is, some cities decided to nibble around the edges because it was too hard to get white people to support a full justice model of public safety, because for them, they were safe. They didn't really see a problem. And because of systemic racism, the way we all kind of grew up in the US with these messages around race of who we should be afraid of and how we should respond to them, you know, it becomes really hard if you don't do any work to work against those messages, to not see Black and brown people as dangerous and a threat, right? It's why you have thousands, if not millions of stories of Black people saying that, you know, what they share in common are stories of white women, you know, grabbing their purse, walking across the street when they see Black and brown people coming, locking their doors, right? These are all the outproduct of the way we are socialized to be afraid of Blackness, to be afraid of brownness. It's not by accident. It's what the US socialization around race has done to all of us. And it prevents us from having the kind of relationships across race that we're supposed to have, right? To be able to think our way through some of these problems that they privilege white communities differently than Black and brown communities. Like, this isn't the way the world was supposed to work. And this is our moment to right size it, to get it the way that it's supposed to work, right? We're supposed to take care of each other. We're supposed to make sure that we have equity, and we're supposed to make sure that I don't get, you know, more than what you get, right? Especially in terms of safety, right? And being at risk. So in my mind, this is really a no-brainer, right? We just have to move people to work together and to hear each other's story, right? And to do what we know is right to do, which is to make our systems work for us and not on us. The
So
policing system is working on people of color. It's not
So
working for them.
another change that's happened, I'd say, in the last 50 to 70 years is that there's all this federal aid available to offload excess military stuff onto police forces. And that wasn't true, I don't think. I'm not sure when it started, but I think it was maybe in the last 50 years. So there's pressures that are coming externally to reinforce that vision of police.
yeah,
And I mean, it's not just even on the level of, you know, chasing down any Black person on the street, but, you know, I mean, you saw it during the protests in September that the police were looking like an army against all those unarmed civilians who were peacefully protesting. So that there is more than just Rochester to worry about in terms of reinventing how they think.
can I just say something real quick, because I want to
Yeah.
bring some attention to one thing. You know, when Rev was talking about, you know, the idea of, you know, you know, local white folks or people that really benefited from policing, that, you know, kept up and upheld policing in order to keep, you know, Black and brown folks insulated, isolated, you know, and controlled. You know, I also want to make the point that, you know, local city governments or town governments did the same, right? Federal governments did the same, and that, you know, these systems can be dismantled or reimagined or retooled in order to benefit the towns and cities that they're in. They just have to be done. And, you know, to kind of drive the point home that it's been seen as too difficult, right? Because they're these giant behemoth organizations. They are the biggest part of a lot of city governments, including ours. So, and they have like a giant immovable budget, right? Which is over $100 million a year. So
But you're going to get 5 million of it, right?
I don't know. Well, we hope we will, right? We're still hoping. That's still not been passed yet. And there's still a lot of questions we have even about what that $5 million is going to look like now that we've asked more questions. You know, it seems like it's allotted to a certain budget line, but we don't really know if it's going to go to all of what we're asking the city to do. So there's still more things that we still will have to discuss with the city. But I think the thing I want to say is this, that, you know, cities can reallocate funds to different parts of their cities that are struggling, or their towns, people that are struggling, instead of just having it be about policing, right? If we just funnel everything into a hole of, You know, again, getting back to the point where I need to have people controlled. I need to have people happy, right? People always want to see police on the streets, but really the fact, just like I think we talked about it on WXXI yesterday, days are blending together. Yesterday was that, you know, there are, well, you know, why don't we just have more police? I was like, well, if you're seeing more crime in the street, folks, we just had a pandemic where a lot of people lost their jobs, right? So why aren't we talking about that? You know, how are these systems? How do they work? Are they working? The answer is no, and we all know that. We have so many community foundations and engagements that work to help people in the city alone that keep them and try to keep them healthy. You know, give them food, give them clothing. We have a bunch of folks that were just grassroots that even like put up their own food stands to feed people.
Right.
You know, so that's what I'm saying. We talk about, you know, we all have these community things, but we really need to make sure that that city government is also doing that to actually disseminate that down to just the regular folks here to make sure that they can get what they need. But we all are so community rich here, resource rich, I believe. But I think that it just needs to start from the top down to actually get to where it needs to go.
I appreciate that, Shani, because what Shani is talking about is that last part, right, of how do we get to public safety and thriving communities? You have to invest in communities if you want them to thrive. And investing in policing budgets without restraint does not automatically create a thriving community in Black and Brown neighborhoods. That's not our formula for how that will happen. And I think you're right that, in fact, I know you're right, that this work of reimagining policing needs to really be done, right, everywhere. But we have to first realize that we can do it, right? And we've done it before. You know, we've created a new blueprint for mental health care, right? And the care for those who are disabled. I was a nurse for 28 years. And when I started nursing in psychiatric care, we were institutionalized everybody who had mental illness, right? We sent them to state hospital and we put them in a locked ward and, you know, and didn't have to think about them and people with disabilities. We put them on a locked ward at Monroe Developmental Center and we forgot about them, right? With caregivers behind the walls. And then, you know, 5 years into my career, the institution decided, you know what, we need a new blueprint for how we do care. And we started to go from institutionalizing people to reintegrating them back into community, to creating homes out in the community, right? To restoring the humanity of people. That's really all we're asking the white community to join people of color communities in as it relates to policing. We have an opportunity to restore humanity, right? Back into what real public safety should be. And we don't need to be afraid of that. Like, we should trust our brilliance. We should trust our collective wisdom, and we should get about it. We do this all the time where we call groups together and say, you know, we're going to work on a new paradigm to do X, Y, or Z. To think that we are not strong enough or have enough fortitude to do this is really playing ourselves really too low. This is something that we can do and we should do. We should fix this.
Thank you. That really helped me put it in perspective, the parallels with the mental health treatment. So you've mentioned a couple of times white people being afraid and white people resisting. And so can we talk about what you're seeing? Like, you guys are all around the community talking about this, and I assume you talk to white people. So have we turned some kind of corner? And I want to specifically say you talked as if it was a year ago with George Floyd that people started noticing. But the truth is, in the 90s, we had like the first, you know, phone recording of police brutality. I've forgotten now what the sweet man's name who thinks we should all get along. And
Rodney King.
Yes, Rodney King. So, you know, that didn't go well. We didn't see any police accountability there. So do you see a change in the willingness of white people to do this work and rethink our models?
So
I am seeing some. I would say I'm not seeing enough, but I am seeing some, right? And that some that we are seeing is encouraging. And then why I say that is because I talk to politicians, state politicians, right, local politicians, who tell me that their constituency, their white constituency, they say to me, Reverend Myra, my constituency is afraid. They're afraid to even talk about defund, refund, right? Which is really a fancy word for reallocating policing budgets so that you invest in communities so that you can actually change the blueprint of policing. And they tell me that their white constituents and white voters, right, are afraid and they want police and they only hear the word defund and they can't even pay attention to a conversation beyond that, which is really necessary, right? Because what we're talking about is reallocating funds. We're talking about looking at roles, right? What community people can do those roles? What roles are we putting on policing that don't belong there, right? And we have this premise that we've bought into that somehow more police on the street solves crimes, when the truth is that police are sent to crimes after they've been committed. They're not our crime prevention group. They never have been, right? They show up and they do reports for us. They show up and they survey the scene. If it's been a murder, they come, right? And they tape it off and they collect evidence. But by the time they arrive, those crimes have already happened. Right. And so if we're really talking about reducing crime, we have to then talk about investing in community, giving those communities what they need. That's what's going to reduce crime, giving them the options, right? The resources, the access that they need to be a thriving community across the board. That's what's going to drive down crime. We've seen it in Newark, New Jersey. You know, they went for some reforms to nibble around the edges, but even in those reforms that they did, because they stepped fully into them, right? They noticed this whole drop, right? 40%, I think it was, drop in crimes because they were investing in the community. They were investing in those relationships. They did defund part of those policing budgets, right? They really were trying to hear and take seriously what people of color in their communities were saying, you know, and while there's some progress, here's the thing, because they didn't take on the entire blueprint of policing, but they took on reforms, they're still afraid that when the Justice Department pulls out, right, that have been guiding and supervising, overseeing those reforms, they're afraid that when they pull out, that all the progress they made will rescind, right? Because Big Brother, right, is not there to watch them. And that's the beauty of a city saying, we're just going to redo this blueprint, right? So that it can live beyond, right, a federal oversight group or right, or a Justice Department. Like, we can actually just fix it structurally, institutionally, fix it in terms of its mission and its vision. And then we don't need anybody to watch us, right? Except for our police accountability board that's local, right? That, you know, keeps the system honest about what is happening so that the community can continue to have in the kind of engagement and the kind of work that needs to happen in order to keep moving us to where we need to be together.
So I appreciate Myra saying that, because, you know, there's been a lot of talk about federal monitoring and oversight. And I think it's just, you know, just the frustration with all of the, you know, the legal, you know, that the PAB is in, you know, still trying to fight for their own disciplinary power. And, you know, I agree, though, that, you know, if we put our own, if we put our own future into somebody else, I really don't think, I think that's to our detriment. And I think that, you know, our community knows what we want. And I think that we just have to be given a chance and given the tools in order to do that. So I have, and another thing that I was just talking about, like, you know, again, centering this around community, but also making sure that people that need resources have resources. You know, I have patients that I can't even get, you know, just simple care management needs met for them. They need diapers, they need formula, right? They need just, you know, toiletries, you know, things that just people need that other, you know, folks take for granted. But we have these problems that are still just kind of cycling through generation after generation, and we have to actually, stop placing it on everybody else to solve, stop placing it on different organizations to solve these problems, and start, tackling them head on at the highest levels of government here. So I really think that, centering it around our community is really what's going to be what changes the game. And look, you've got young folks that are, that I was just talking with a reporter earlier about what's changed in Rochester. I was like, I really think that this is the beginning of, our civil rights movement, where, that this is this, George Floyd, this being a worldwide, movement about, really bringing to task, some of the old world, old laws that have kind of governed this country and governed our local police departments, and our local things that have just been allowed to perpetuate themselves over years and years and years. That a lot of young people are starting to get involved, starting to get mobilized, energized, and starting to come up with their own strategies on how to redefine their public safety system.
So I spent a lot of time last summer, probably you guys, I mean, that's where I first met you, Shani, is at one of those Black Lives Matter rallies. I was really encouraged that about half the crowds there were white. Like, a lot of people were showing up on a weekly basis to cheer on the simple facts that Black Lives Matter. So I take hope where I can find it, but that encouraged me a lot. I want to throw a new question into the works here. So, Monroe County has Rochester in the middle, and then it's got that ring of suburbs, which were built basically to segregate the population as more Blacks moved up from the south. So we've got a sheriff for the county, and we've got a police department for the city. How important is that? The sheriff's up for re-election this year. I don't have a clear understanding. Are they completely separate? I mean, the sheriff's department runs the county jail. Is that where people go when they get arrested? How big is this a county issue as well as a city issue?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, what I do know is, I think what we all learned from the protests this past summer is that when needed, all of those entities come together, right? And work in solidarity, particularly in protest, against the citizens, right, to sort of manage and control them. I just remember several nights when I was part of those protests with Shani and many in the city of Rochester, that there would be RPD in the riot gear in front of the public safety building, and then you had the sheriffs on the bridge, and they had their guns and equipment, as a backup, and then you had troopers who were in the garage, right, ready to be deployed if they needed to. And so we were really looking. You had sharpshooters who were on the roof, right? Because I'm a nurse, I surveyed the scene. I'm like, oh, well, look at that. There's a group there. There's a group there. They're peeking out of the garage there. And so in those moments, right, all of these individual law enforcement entities were coming together, right, against the citizens who were protesting, and ready, right, to use whatever paramilitary or military forces that they felt or were commanded that they had permission to use. We saw all those videos, the use of the pepper spray, and and then the sonic things, and then one night it was those things, and dogs that were brought out. And I mean, I just think that this is our moment, really, to reimagine law enforcement in all of its forms, right? So that they can adhere to some commitment of equity and transparency and justice, right? Both interagency law enforcement and and intercommunity approaches, with collective intervention goals, right? That we can all get to, that's really devoid of being centered around authoritarianism and power that that harms people of color in particular in oppressed communities. I think we can do better. Like, I think we can build into all of those types of law enforcement agencies a commitment to end police abuse, right? And one of the ways that New Jersey did it, and is reassigning roles that could be attended to by community members who are trained in intervention and understanding the community it serves. Even in Rochester, we just had, I think it was last week, UCLM just proposed that kind of thing as a point of reform, creating a group that would be trained in intervention and that would pilot, right, a different role in a community to take police out of that particular role. So we'll know more about how that rolls out a year from now, and we don't really have all the specifics, but that piece is exactly a piece that we, the Pastors Faith Leaders Roundtable, put into the new policing blueprint proposal, was to do just that we needed to have convene this process to be thinking through just that kind of thing of reassigning those roles. And to a new policing blueprint would recognize that systemic violence is a pattern crime. Like, we haven't even gotten to that, right? To look at all the stories and all the experiences and say, you know what, this is a pattern crime like all other crimes that have occurred throughout our city, and that it was going to require continual engagement with victims and offenders, right? And it's going to require sure and swift consequences for police, like we have for other perpetrators of crime in our community, right? And it's going to require that we refund the community through, what we're calling for is a community chest, right? Some resources that, will be essential for the additional support services to create real public safety. And and to really exhibit the power of the criminal justice system and the public safety system by sending the right, consistent message of help, accountability, and partnership to create a thriving community. If we do not do that, then we are creating a system that is incongruent with the language and the words we put on it, right? We can put forth a commitment to act in ways that reduce unintended consequences and end the disparity of impact on people of color victims, and to work with offenders throughout the community and really help police, and what I like to call them as public safety practitioners. We can actually help them feel good about the full work that they do and not just the pieces that they do. Like, public safety is so much bigger.
Okay,
Right?
I'm going to
Yes.
interrupt you for a minute. First of all, I want to share a question. Somebody is in the chat is interested in this blueprint for policing. Is that a publicly available document? Where would someone find
it? It is a publicly available document. They can go to spirituschristi.org to our racial justice page and find it listed there. And they also can go to I think it's still, the city of Rochester had it in their addendum of the proposal, the recommendations that they sent to city council. I'm not sure what they did with it after that. City council did vote eventually on some reform proposals. So they did not vote to fully accept the revised blueprint for policing, and for the reasons that I named, right? That they feel that people are too afraid, and we just don't have good thought leaders who will create forums to break this down for folks, right? To help us move past our fear and our anxiety. Like, for me, I'm very excited about this moment to do something different and do something meaningful. And I'm not, yeah.
I want to see another sort of ray of hope of how possible it is to get people to think differently about something. And that is the whole issue of sexual abuse, especially child sexual abuse, which has always happened and it wasn't really considered a problem. And, we've been able to change minds and change systems. And so I see a lot of hope there that, yeah, actually people can learn new ideas and act on them
Absolutely.
and
We have such
really
a
wholeheartedly get on board. I think when they started talking, there were some people who thought, oh, you're just exaggerating, or it's not that big a deal, or, there's a few bad apples, or all the things that people said. And yet they began to see it as a system that needed to change. And actually a lot has changed.
Yeah.
Uh,
A
Yeah, I
good
think
system will help, good and bad actors, right? We're doing the whole group of officers a favor by supporting a new policing blueprint. Everybody benefits from that. Everybody, right?
So we just this week had the first Black police officer in Rochester pass away at the age of 98.
Mm.
Uh, so how big an influence have Black police officers had in moving us to this point where we can reimagine police? Is that a big deal, or they were just fitting into a system and it was hard to change from the inside?
I think you'd have to ask them, right? I think that that's really, I know that that the officer that you mentioned, I forget his name offhand, but I knew that he encountered a significant amount of racism and racism in the earliest parts of the department here.
Sure, he did.
And I know that he said that he also had some real moments of triumph, but I know all of it is difficult. It's just like, being the champion of the Black race in some of these spaces is it's just a lot to carry. So I guess you'd have to ask. I guess you'd have to ask each individual person how they felt like they impacted it. I don't know. I necessarily have an answer for that.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I would say it's probably both and, right? I think that there are people who, whether they're Black officers or not, right, that the system's culture is too much for them to feel like they can
I can
afford change.
imagine that it would be
And
really hard, yeah. And especially
so,
if you come in at the bottom, which I'm sure they did, right?
yeah, I mean, and I've had some experiences with Black officers who've told me some of this stuff. There was a Black officer, a female Black officer who is now retired from RPD, but she shared many stories of just the racism of not feeling like she'd lay out this vision for humanity to be given in people of color communities, and felt that it was completely ignored by the majority of her white officers, and that at some point she just felt like she was beating her head up against the wall, and she decided to get out, right, and to go do
Yeah,
something else in law enforcement. And then, when several years back, we had a white officer in RPD who put together a racist piece of communication and sent it around to all the RPD officers, making fun of the way in which poor Black people talk, right? And saying that he was trying to educate them, right? First of all, he's not the one that needs to be educating. It was very demeaning. It was derogatory. It was racist, right? And they were making fun, right, of Black and brown folks in the community. And it was actually Black officers who went to, I think Duffy was the police chief at the time. They went to him and said, you need to do something about this. We need to find out who's doing it, and they need to go, right? And so we had this huge splash of, the person, Duffy, coming out and saying, when he finds out who did it, they're going to be fired. And we had this huge news article that, they found out who did it, and that he was fired. Well, the truth is he wasn't fired, right? He was allowed to resign. And there's a difference. It's important because when you're allowed to resign, what happened is he was allowed to then go to Myra, work there for a year till things cooled down. And then he came right back, right, with a new police chief, and was reapplied and was rehired,
exactly.
right, and continued to work
Yeah.
on RPD. And so I think there are a lot of, and if you think about what message does that send to Black officers, right?
Yeah.
So I'll say, I think it's both. And I think there are people who try to change the system, as Shani says, who have some successes. And I think there are others who just feel like, you know what, I just need to put in my time, because, it's either too heavy of a lift, or the culture is too hard. And like you said, they're not supermen and women. They try to do what they can. And I think it's a partnership for the community, right? To join officers who really want to do it right and want to do it well. And one way for us to join them is to support a new policing blueprint so that they don't have to do both and, right? They can just work within a system that's just and accountable and fair.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. And since we're the League of Women Voters, I would like to turn the conversation to the fact that we have an election coming up next month. So we've got 5 seats open on the city council for election or re-election. And we've got a plethora of candidates. We've got 2 candidates for mayor. And we've also got the entire county ledge up for re-election this year. And there's a lot of primaries in June, especially the city seats, I think, are mostly contested, and a few of the suburban seats are contested in the primaries. So what would you like to tell our voters about how to be effective at finding out who they should vote for in terms of this issue? What questions do you want to see them ask? Who is it most important that they ask them to?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the questions that I would encourage voters to ask is find out what commitments these candidates are going to make around the changes we need for racial justice, right? We often don't ask them those kinds of things, right? But even the decisions around tax bases, and tax laws, and who pays them and how they pay them, and all these things have to do and have an impact on us in terms of depending on what racial group we are part of. Like, I'd like to know who's going to support, right, the steps that are required to reimagine policing, right, to invest in communities to make them, to help them become thriving communities. Like, what resources are they willing to commit to? I mean, we've had Black and brown communities for years just simply divested in, like, having nothing poured into them, right? Because those monies are reallocated into predominantly white communities, right? And more affluent communities. And so the communities that need them the most, I want to know, if those communities are in the purview of these candidates and what they're going to do about it. What are we going to do about the children in the Rochester City School District? What resources are they willing to put there? What laws are they willing to advocate for, right, to address the systemic racism that has been allowed to linger and create substandard education for kids of color and poverty for kids of color in this community? Like, I don't know why we would stand by and not ask those specific questions and want that kind of progress to happen in our own backyard.
And
right?
I'd like to piggyback on that and say it's important to ask those same questions to the county ledge.
Absolutely.
Because, the county controls the budgets for most of the things that can fight poverty in this area. And they run the administration that administers them. And, the people who represent the neighborhoods that you're talking about have to be effective actors at the county table. So they should really be asking hard questions of those wannabe county ledges people.
Especially the county ledge people, but like I say, I think all politicians, right? I think we go too easy on them in terms of, not expecting enough, right, of those who hold power in our city and in our county. I think, for example, the annoyance law that got through in Rochester, that would have put, thousands of people of color in jeopardy and created an incarceration crisis simply because Black and brown folks would have annoyed the police, right? And so that came to us through the county ledge.
Yes, it did.
They delivered that law to us, and there was no process, racially just process for communities of color or even white communities to challenge that, to speak to that, to lay that out, to disagree with that, to redress it. Like it just got pushed straight through and laid on the backs of those who live in Black and brown communities. Thank God we were able to organize on the ground and strategize collectively and collaboratively for repeal of that annoyance law. And some groups had, some groups that, had relationships with certain law enforcement groups where they decided that they wouldn't use it until it went through a law review, right, as their way to honor the relationships that we were building and that were being built in the community. But there were other law enforcement, groups of folks who said they would use it. And it would have become a very dangerous place, a more dangerous place for Black and brown folks. So absolutely, County Ledge, we can't leave any stone unturned. We must ask these questions with a racial justice lens so that we get to a place of full humanity for everybody. And it matters, right, who has the power to create policies that can disproportionately impact us.
Yeah.
And if we want to be fair-minded people and we're really concerned about each other's humanity and each other's ability to thrive, then we have to be willing to ask the hard questions.
Shani, you wanted
yeah.
to say something. Yeah.
So for me, I'd say for people that would like to, an educated voter is an empowered voter, excuse me. And I think that when voters need to ask questions and need to just do some listening. For instance, I would like to know, especially since I'm here representing the Police Accountability Board, how is it that, ask specific questions and just look for specific answers? Like, for instance, I wrote down, how will you empower the PAB to do what it needs to do? What detailed steps will you take to make sure that that gets done? Do you believe in the fully independent Police Accountability Board, which is what the charter was based on? 75% of voters voted for this within the city of Rochester. Do you believe that that is true? Do you believe that they should be fully funded and that they should have a say in how they use the money that it's allocated to them? Do you have a sense that, or do you have a belief that the Rochester Police Department has to be fundamentally changed in how it operates and how it deals with Black and brown people? How will you make sure that the Police Accountability Board will get the cooperation of, city government and also Rochester Police Department? Will you take steps to make sure that that happens? See, more detailed questions need to be asked because there's a lot of generalities and how people will do things in the general sense and not a lot of detail. And people should be really interested in the detail.
I love that. I still agree with Shani. The additional questions, right, is do you believe that we should put stability within everyone's reach where it comes to policing?
Right.
Do you believe that we should stop making poverty into a crime?
Right.
Do you believe we should treat kids like kids, right, and not like adults? Do you believe we should allow people to grow and change and treat addiction and mental illness like medical issues and not like criminal events, right? Do you believe we should collect data to understand and address the circumstances that cause violence to erupt and spread, whether it's police violence or street violence, right? Do you believe that we should have more people of color-led agencies and perspectives on public safety? And how would you support that happening, right? I mean, there's so many questions that we can ask really through this racial justice lens, right? Will you support providing targeted resources, right, to people who are victims of serious physical harm and trauma? I mean, there's just a plethora of questions that we can ask. And if you don't know what to ask, I would encourage people to, connect with an activist group, a social justice group, and let them help you work through some questions to ask.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you both and thank you very much. And I'm also going to share my screen because I want to promote an effort of the League of Women Voters to help voters be informed. So I think we can turn our cameras off now. So we make this online voter guide every election. It's called vote411.org. So you can go there and put in your own address and it will show you who is on your ballot based on where you live. So you'll see who your county ledge wannabes are. You'll see the judges, you'll see the city council members, and we did ask a series of questions to them, which they will answer, and then they will give links to their own website. So it's a really good place to start your research. So once again, thank you both. And I'm sure we'll be in conversation again. I'm thinking about the sheriff's race in the fall. I might be calling you back and seeing how we can get that conversation started.
That would be fabulous. Thank you so much
Okay,
for having us.
thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much.
Have a nice night. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.